All right, here we go. We are back to John Locke, second treatise. This time we are going to be going through chapter 7, which is titled Of Political or Civil Society. But that title seems to me a bit of a misnomer, because we're going to get into this chapter and then we're going to find what the actual meat of this chapter is. And it's not just about political or civil society. It's actually Locke's attempt to disprove something about absolute monarchy. So here we go. The start of the chapter begins with kind of an extended meditation on the intentions of God in putting, man into circumstances that encourage entry into society. He starts out by thinking about marital society, basically, man and wife. He mentions that, that was kind of the original society, is that two people voluntarily joined together for the purposes of the furtherance of the species, right? He mentions that naturally goes into a kind of a parent and child society, which is another form. It's got more direct authority, but authority for a limited time, I guess, is a way to put it. And then that authority kind of moves into the authority of a master versus a servant, someone who, offers allegiance or whatever to someone who accepts that allegiance. However, Locke notes, all of these kind of natural, limited versions of society fall short of what Locke is calling political society. Locke continues with his meditation by noting that different animals maintain their mating bonds for different lengths of time, as appropriate to their species. He talks about how, like grass-eating animals don't really stick around too long because there's no upbringing required to learn how to eat grass, basically, is his argument. But, but like predatory animals need to teach their young how to hunt, kind of thing. In humans, he says, since human children take a long time to rear to adulthood, to get their reason, to, take full stock of their own rights, the husband and wife connection is must be long enough to serve that purpose, and beyond that, as dictated by society, if they're part of a greater society. It's worth noting that there's a lot of God talk here, but the bottom line is that familial society is not the same as absolute monarchy, and familial rules typically determined and familial rules are typically determined by positive law when in society. So, there may be laws that regulate how divorce works, for instance, is kind of what he's getting at, or what he seems to be getting at. He notes again, and we covered this already, right, with the parent-child thing from the last chapter, but he says, familial bonds don't confer absolute power. They never do. The wife and children have rights and expectations in their relationship with their father, husband, whatever. And the same is true of a master and a servant, except for slaves, Locke notes, who they've already kind of forfeited their lives by being aggressors in an unjust war, and then taken as what Locke would probably call just slaves. As we have to go back to his writings on the state of war, right, where he's like, person A declares that he's going to kill or conquer person B. Person B is just kind of sitting there. Person B defeats person A and could, perfectly reasonably, perfectly justly decide to kill person A, but person A says, if you don't kill me, I will be your servant until I decide I don't want to be your servant anymore, and then you can kill me, right? There's no part where person A is like, well, I committed mass murder and now I just expect to be, forgiven for that. No, that the person who has started or, gone forward with actions, that induced a state of war, that person has basically forfeited his life. And, if you could kill someone in single combat, then you could also say, I won't kill you if you serve me. That's kind of Locke's perspective, right? And we saw that in chapters, 3 and 4 of war and of the state of war and of slavery. And because these slaves are technically, dead, They aren't part of society, properly speaking, Locke says. Again, this is something that we could definitely kind of pick at, but for our purposes, we're going to just kind of gloss over it because it's not very relevant. There aren't very many, even today, right, when we have the most totalitarian governments that have ever existed, there aren't that many people who are, first of all, there aren't very many just wars, right? And second of all, there aren't very many people who are taken as prisoners and then, handed as slaves to the victors, right? There's positive law created by society that already kind of deals with that and has mostly nullified it, as far as we can tell. So we're just going to kind of like leave this as it is, realize that it's kind of not particularly relevant now. that positive laws have already kind of closed that door off. So whatever. This is just Locke kind of going from his earlier chapters and saying this is the result of this. This person is not in society because they are technically dead. Anyway. Locke notes that man is born with this perfect freedom within the law of nature, that as long as he sticks to the laws of reason, no one can justly, harm him, etc., etc., etc. Locke says, specifically this includes life, liberty, and your estate, and the ability to punish wrongdoers should one be so convinced that they are wrongdoers. Again, this is the main problem with the law, the state of nature, right? Is that there's no one to say, beyond a shadow of a doubt, we have proven that, person A robbed person B, and therefore, person A must give restitution to person B. In the state of nature, you either are dealing fairly with other people, or you decide that they've committed some kind of crime and you yourself take it upon yourself to punish them, and there's no one above you to punish you for punishing them. Again, this is a very chaotic system, right? In the sense that a person could be convinced of another person's evil or evil act without that actually being true. And that's the purpose of Locke's plea for, not plea, but like Locke's perspective on why people enter society. They enter society in order to have someone to impartially decide these kinds of disputes, so that people don't just say, well, Bob told me that you killed this person, so I'm going to kill you, and you said it simplifies things to have someone who's not part of the argument to make the judgment. Again, that's one of Locke's most important, most early, most significant points, is that no man may be his own judge. Because to be one's own judge is to put oneself in the state of nature, and possibly, therefore, the state of war with the people who have disputes with you. And that's what we're going to get to later in the chapter. So, continuing, society, when joining into society, man gives up his right to punish wrongdoers, except in the cases of imminent self-defense, where a judge can't be brought in time to deal with the problem, right? The society becomes umpire by whatever set of positive laws they decide, as long as those positive laws are reasonably within the tenets of the law of reason. Society sets punishments and decides what is a transgression. Now, this is again kind of hard to reconcile the power of a society to enact positive law with the principle that society should only be there to keep men obeying the laws of reason. If the laws of reason are perfectly known, then every society would have the same laws. If the laws of reason are vague or arguable in certain cases, then that opens up a way for societies to kind of grab extra power that they shouldn't, quote unquote, be able to grab, according to Locke. There's a footnote in this part where Locke says, quote, or says, public power is above all individuals, quote, unless there be reason showed, which may necessarily enforce that the law of reason or of God doth enjoin the contrary. And again, this is one of those things that can be, in certain cases, argued in good faith, either side of certain issues. We have this problem where the laws of reason are not perfectly self-evident. Locke claims that the laws of reason are self-evident, but I think that there's plenty of historical evidence to suggest that not all of them are self-evident, right? If only self-evident things are the law of reason, then there's a very limited number of things that are the law of reason. And if the law of reason extends beyond the things that are absolutely self-evident, then that gives a state, a society, an opportunity to grab power that it otherwise wouldn't be able to grab. So, another point is that society handles conflicts with outsiders, Locke says. Again, this is some of that horizontal integration that we from a voluntarist perspective, need to be very careful about. Locke is saying here that the police, the judges, and the army must all be the same organization, and we know that that's just not true. We also know, for instance, that like a chunk of land need not be contiguous to be owned by a person or an organization, right? Like just the U.S. alone has Hawaii and Alaska. They're not part of the states, but they're part of the contiguous states, but they are part of the United States. A state or a government doesn't need to cover, a particular area of land, and there's no logical reason why those areas can't change over time. From a voluntarist perspective, we need to be very careful about Locke sneaking in these horizontal integrations and these perspectives of like the sacrosanctness of current borders, right? We got to watch out for that. Another point that Locke makes is that the government may order citizens to exact punishment upon the guilty, since it is their representative. Again, Locke is assuming that the government has the state of a servant and the people are the master. This is again different from the perspective of absolute monarchy, where the people are the servants to the master who is the king. It's also worth noting that Locke isn't saying here that the government can order, hey, you go kill him, necessarily, but it's saying that it will create systems of organized positive law that will assign who, exacts these punishments on behalf of the rest of society. So there's a little bit of collectivism here where there's a little bit of fogginess going on that a smart person could pick at and maybe argue against. So we got to watch out for that too. Moving forward, we get to the actual real meat of the chapter here. Because this chapter is titled Of Political or Civil Society, just as a reminder. What Locke is actually doing here in the second part of this chapter is he is attempting to prove that absolute monarchy is inconsistent with civil society. And the reason he says this is the case is because there isn't anyone there to settle disputes between the citizens and the princes, whoever both sides happen to be. Basically, the prince, by choosing to have an absolute monarchy, has said that there is that I shall be the judge of my own cases. And because of that innate bias that Locke warns us of in the second chapter, I believe, this is something that is incompatible with Locke's conception of what a civil society is. If a person is an absolute monarch, what he has done by saying that he shall judge all the cases that involve him vis-a-vis others, he has put himself in the state of nature at best, and in a state of war at worst with his citizens. Basically, Locke is saying here that if someone claims absolute power over you without your consent, and without you having done something to give them that absolute power, such as, fomenting an unjust war against them and then losing, right? If those conditions aren't satisfied, then you are not in a society with this person, this prince, this slave owner, whatever you want to call him. You are in the state of nature and can move yourself, per your decisions, into the state of war whenever you decide that's reasonable for you. This is something that is, I think, really important to Locke's system, I guess, is that people, when people usurp power, what they're doing is they're putting themselves into a state whereby you can claim that they're not in a society with you, right? This is the way that societies break down, basically, is that the government takes too much power, takes too much authority, usurps too much of the people's things or their rights or whatever, goes far beyond what its limitations by the laws of reason ought to be, and becomes a tyranny, becomes an absolute monarchy. And again, it doesn't need to actually dictate everything. It merely needs to claim the ability to dictate anything in order to put itself back into the state of nature with its supposed society. Locke also kind of notes that just the presence of judges doesn't fix this problem, because those judges are not there to deal with disputes between the citizens and the prince. Locke says that the princes basically provide citizens with judges for each other, for the same reason that a farmer cares for his livestock. When you are in a situation where there is no remedy, when the prince causes others to believe themselves, when there's no remedy, when there's no possible source of justice without someone making the decision for themselves that you're in the dispute with, that puts them in the state of nature to you. Basically, Locke is underlining the fact that the whole reason for joining civil society, for not being in the state of nature, is to avoid being at the arbitrary whims of aggressors, right? Again, Locke's primeval state of man consists of two things. The state of nature, in which there's peaceable intercourse between people based on the laws of reason, and the state of war, where people try to take things from each other or kill each other or whatever. And in man's primeval state, if such a thing existed, the point is that there's a lot of war going on. There's a lot of people who, because of the peculiarity of their force of arms or something like that, are willing to subjugate others, right? This is something that if government doesn't fix this problem, then there's no point for government to exist. If the society doesn't fix this problem, doesn't bring people who would be willing to do horrible things to bear, to ground, or whatever the idiom is, right? If it doesn't exert its authority over them as well, to curb those predilections, I guess, is maybe the word I was trying to think of. Basically, you're in no better of a situation than you are in the state of nature. If the government allows people to aggress against you willy-nilly, then you're not really in a society anymore. This is the breakdown of society, I guess Locke might consider it. That is to say that, again, if society is not serving purposes, if it's not making you better off than you would be without it, then it's not actually a society anymore, because it's no longer got your consent. This is kind of the thing where if a society devolves into an unaccountable mess, there's not really any reason to maintain membership in it. If you're living in an anarcho-tyranny where, your self-defense is prevented, but people robbing you are not sanctioned, then there's no reason for you to be a part of the system, and therefore you can always maintain or take back the freedom to say, no, I am in a state of nature with you, with these aggressors, with whatever, and I will deal with this situation in whatever way I find most positive to myself. There's a point here. There's a quote. Government has no other end but the preservation of property. That is in this chapter. It's one of those things where Locke is placing inherent limits on government, but there's almost no government so limits itself. This is the problem. Also, Locke centralizes and horizontally integrates things more than a person might than he proves is logically necessary. And so, he says this, but the situations that he is pointing at so far, the arguments that he's made so far, give enough leeway that this is still not quite, what we want to hear, what makes sense. He hasn't made the argument for the horizontal integration, and he hasn't shown what a person should do when the government goes beyond preservation of property as its purpose. So, again, we're dealing with these situations where Locke is kind of making these assumptions based on, I think, his, the state of the world, the state of history at the time he was writing. It's it's and at the same time, I think he's also trying to avoid direct references to things like rebellions, but it seems to me like he's making an argument for it. If there is someone who chooses to judge, who forces you to take him as the judge for disputes between him and you, then that person has, it is as morally acceptable to use force on that person as it would be to any other aggressor in the state of nature, is what Locke seems to be getting at, without really saying, go kill the king, which, we saw what happened to Algernon Sidney when he wrote something, when he wrote things that could be thought of that way. And I guess Locke was trying, and successfully, because he didn't get executed, to make, the argument without really making the argument. Anyway, let's keep going. There's only a little bit more left in this chapter. So the next major point that Locke makes is that civil government, and this is kind of building on what we just talked about, civil government must bind equally all within society, even the, and quote, meanest. And meanest is one of those words that is had a different meaning in olden times. Right now, meanness is just like, being a jerk, but like meanness back then meant the basest, I guess we would call it, like the basest, the most prone to outbursts of violence or theft or whatever. Continuing with Locke's argument here, any man exempted from the laws of civil society puts himself back into the state of nature with respect to that society. Again, he's just kind of underlining again that if a person does things that violate the laws of reason, and the society, the government, does nothing to prevent that, then that person also has put himself into a state of nature, and any person, in society or not, because he's not in that society, can say, you have transgressed against me and I shall punish you for it. This is, again, this is Locke's juggling act to keep himself away from the noose, basically, without saying what he really seems to be trying to say. It's also worth noting that Locke defines anarchy as the statement that the state of nature and civil society are one and the same. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the arguments that we're making here? Okay. I think Locke partly is making a mistake because the state of nature is the state in which people are peaceable with each other. They follow the laws of reason with respect to each other, and they have the right to punish transgressors, but those transgressors, by Locke's definitions, have put themselves into a state of war and not the state of nature with the people who are going to do the punishing, at least ideally, right? The state of nature is a state in which there's no umpire, there's no referee, and so a person could easily be convinced that a person did a bunch of wrong things when it's not true. There's no standards of evidence. There's no positive law to explain how the process is supposed to work to ensure justice. All there is the will of a person to, punish someone who he believes has done something wrong. Again, in civil society, this right is willingly delegated by the people to the government, and the government makes those decisions and creates a system by which no man is his own judge. There is no absolute prince or absolute king. There is no absolute, and the legislature and the judicial systems need themselves to be limited by the laws of reason. The things that they do must be mostly self-evidently correct to the majority of people, or those people may, by their decision, take away their consent and treat those bodies as if they are transgressors. It's a very fine line to walk, and it's even more difficult because of the tendency for governments to grow. If governments never made mistakes, this would be easier. But governments can and do make mistakes. The people who make up the government, despite their processes, even if those processes are very well designed, could have perverse incentives, could have personal grudges, could have a variety of different things that cause them to judge a person differently from how an impartial person would judge that person. And so this is one of those issues with the state in and of itself. If the state says that it has a monopoly on the decisions of morality, for instance, and it also has the ability to judge, which things are moral, right? It serves as both the legislator and the judicial system. Then no one under its banner has a really good, what would you call it? An impartial judge for their disputes with the state. And the state, of course, consists of people. And those people can make mistakes, have weird incentives, can make bad decisions, can have bad information. In a state of anarchy, in the primeval state of man, there's occasional pieces. There's occasional bits of people who interact with each other peaceably. But in general, I think Locke is pointing at the fact that the fact that there's no umpire, there's no fair umpire, means that things are going to be a lot more chaotic in the state of nature. That there's going to, as I showed in that little diagram, that little Venn diagram, right? In man's primeval state consists of the state of nature and the state of war. And there may be a lot more war than there is nature, right? There may be a lot more people that interact with each other violently than there are people who interact with each other peaceably. And the fact that the laws of reason are self-evident doesn't require anyone to actually follow them in man's primeval state. As opposed to civil society where, again, people voluntarily and for the purposes of bettering their situation give up certain abilities to punish transgressors in order to give it to someone so that no man may be his own judge. And so the point here is that any system that denies you the ability to have a fair examination of your disputes with anybody, right? Anybody who happens to be in the same society, whether they're a member of the government or not, that system, you may choose to perceive that system as being in the state of nature or even the state of war with whomever you're unable to make those disputes, get an umpire for those disputes. And this could be members of government, or it could just be other people. We've seen cases where, in certain cities, massive amounts of just shoplifting. There's no, protection of property is forbidden, and the people who take the property are not pursued, punished, etc. In that case, I think Locke would probably say that, yeah, the society has broken down here, in the sense that the government is acting arbitrarily, and therefore the people have the right, should they so choose, to dissolve that and rebuild a new society with the rules that the laws of reason expect. This is one of those chapters where Locke is towing a fine line, because he was a British subject speaking in Britain, writing in Britain at the time. And the execution of Algernon Sidney happened after he wrote this, but at the same time, he probably knew that actual sanctions by the king was a significant potential problem that he might have to deal with. And so he's using a lot of very roundabout language here that is, I think, justified by by what happened to various dissidents in Britain at the time, or around that time. This is chapter 7 of Locke's second treatise. The title is Of Political or Civil Society, but the real meat of the chapter, for our purposes, is his attempt to show that absolute monarchies are incompatible with civil society as he defines civil society, and that that systems that permit arbitrary whims or self-judgment for disputes are, that the people in those systems have the right, should they so choose, to dissolve those dissolve those organizations if they believe that they can do better. What he's kind of seems to be setting up here is the idea of process over over rule by man, rule by law instead of rule by man, right? That's something we hear a lot in the revolutionary era. And the point is that the systems that need to be created, or the question that we need to ask ourselves from a voluntarist perspective is there a way to produce these systems in such a way that government usurpation of power over the people is impossible? And the answer might be no, right? It might be that simply the fact that you've given someone the power to do certain things means that they could take more power because they can leverage the power that they've got to get a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. Locke isn't saying the word revolution here in any obvious way, but he is hinting strongly that revolution against unjust systems is something that is permitted, as long as one can point toward cases where the system is arbitrary, self-judging, etc., etc., etc. So that's kind of the meat of this chapter, and I think that the argument against, or the argument about, because it's not an argument against monarchy in a sense, right? It's saying that, yes, absolute monarchies can exist. There can be one person who, by force of arms or force of will, subjugates a large number of people. But Locke's point is that those people who are being subjugated are not deprived of the of the moral right to claim their freedom, and that's something that, I don't know. It's one of those things where Hoppe wrote his book "Democracy: The God That Failed," and in it he says that there are certainly cases where monarchy has better incentives than democracy. There are some issues with that argument in the sense that, like, most monarchies were not established by non-aggressive means, right? Most monarchies that actually existed were established by conquest, and none of those are valid in any sense under Hoppe's framework. The problem is that a lot of people have taken monarchy better than democracy in some cases, in some ways, and turned that into, oh, well, maybe we should go back to absolute monarchies. And Locke's point here is that no absolute monarchy is ever a system that you are morally obligated to subjugate yourself towards under. And this is, I think, kind of the crux of that often gets missed of modern libertarian thought, because there's a lot of left anarchism that goes in and collectivizes things where they don't need to be collectivized, I guess is the way I'd put it. And this book in particular is saying nobody has the right to oppress you this way. And he's saying it in a bit of a roundabout way, but he is saying it. Or at least he's strongly implying it. So, yeah, that will do for this chapter. What I would say is that chapter 8 is called Of the Beginning of Political Societies. It is another fairly long one, so we'll probably do that one as just one video. Hopefully this is helping you to kind of go through and make sure that you get the main points of the book. As always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. We'll have another one next week, assuming I don't have any more. I had some problems with my microphone yesterday, so it destroyed a video that I was recording. We'll see if I can get that back up. Hopefully it didn't do it this time either. But anyway, that's all I've got for today. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And we will continue with more of Locke's second treatise next time. Have a good one.